She didn't even hear the glass shatter before the sting cut across her skin. One moment she was weaving through the golden-lit ballroom, tray balanced carefully in her hand, every step rehearsed from years of practice. The next, crystal sprayed across the floor, champagne fizzing over her shoes, and a deep gash opening across her wrist. Alicia Carter froze, breath-catching, as gasps rose around her. The orchestra didn't stop. The music swelled, violins bright and triumphant, like a cruel soundtrack to her pain. Every pair of eyes seemed to lock on her, not with concern, not with compassion, but with something colder, something that whispered, "This is what happens when you forget your place." At the center of it all stood Richard Halloway, billionaire, philanthropist, darling of Wall Street. To the cameras outside the ballroom doors, he was a man of vision and power. But here, in this moment, his mask slipped. He leaned toward his wife, lips curled, and muttered in a language he believed no one in the room would understand. Elle ne devrait même pas être ici. She shouldn't even be here. His wife smirked, tilting her head in agreement. Laughter rippled softly around their table, laughter meant to sting deeper than broken glass. Alicia pressed a napkin to her wrist, blood seeping through, heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the music anymore. Every instinct told her to walk away, to swallow the humiliation, to disappear into the shadows of the service hall, where waitresses were expected to remain invisible. But she stayed, because sometimes silence is heavier than shame, and as she stood there, bleeding under the chandelier light, a question lodged itself in her chest. How many times could she be cut, by words, by looks, by laughter, before something inside her finally refused to break? You are watching the beginning of that answer. And if you're listening to this right now, ask yourself, what do you do when injustice unfolds right in front of you? Do you stay silent? Do you look away? Or do you take a stand? Because silence is never neutral. Silence feeds the very system that tried to reduce Alicia to nothing more than a servant who didn't belong. So if you feel that silence in the face of injustice is dangerous, subscribe right now. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and if you won't subscribe, then go to the comments, write it out, and admit why you chose not to stand with truth, because this story is just beginning. Long before the glass cut her skin, the world had already been cutting at her spirit. Alicia Carter was 26 years old, but the lines of exhaustion across her face belonged to someone twice her age. By day, she was a graduate from Howard University, first in her family to hold a degree, a young woman who dreamed of teaching French in classrooms that looked like the ones she had sat in as a child. By night, she was just another face in a crisp black uniform, carrying trays heavier than the paycheck that never stretched far enough. New York City was unforgiving. Rent swallowed half her wages. Her younger brother's tuition drained the rest. Every dollar was already spent before it touched her hands. Yet money wasn't the heaviest burden she carried. It was the way strangers looked at her and saw only half the story. The hotel guests who waved her away like furniture, the managers who insisted she smile more so she wouldn't make the guests uncomfortable, the colleagues who whispered, "She's too educated for this job. She won't last." They didn't know that this work wasn't temporary. They didn't know she couldn't afford for it to be temporary. Every night Alicia tied her apron, forced the smile, and told herself, this is survival. Nothing more, nothing less. But survival had a cost. It meant swallowing insults with the same grace she poured champagne. It meant ignoring the sting when guests assumed she was uneducated, when they spoke over her, when they dismissed her as though she were invisible. Invisible. That word followed her everywhere. On the subway ride to work, people bumped her shoulder, never apologizing. In boutiques, security guards shadowed her steps. Even in lecture halls, where her fluency in French should have made her stand tall, professors doubted her ability until she spoke flawless sentences they could no longer ignore. And still, despite all she had endured, tonight felt different. Maybe it was the wound on her wrist, reminding her with every pulse of blood that she was human, fragile, alive. Maybe it was the laughter that echoed when Richard Halloway sneered, a laughter that turned her pain into entertainment. Or maybe it was the way his words, spoken in French, landed in her ears like a challenge, a line she was never meant to cross. He thought she didn't understand. He thought the language of wealth and power would stay locked safely in his mouth. But Alicia understood every word, and though she said nothing yet, something inside her stirred. A quiet vow, a dangerous promise, a recognition that she had spent too long being invisible in rooms that thrived on her silence. For the first time in years, Alicia wondered what might happen if she didn't stay silent. And that thought alone was powerful enough to change everything. The Ritz-Carlton's ballroom was a cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers poured golden light onto tables draped in silk. Champagne towers gleamed like liquid gold, and violins stitched melodies that seemed almost too delicate for the weight of the conversations beneath them. It wasn't just a party. It was a show of dominance. The men who filled these tables were not here to celebrate. They were here to measure each other, to gauge who still had influence, whose empire was growing, and whose name was about to vanish from the headlines. Senators clinked glasses with actors. Oil magnates leaned close to whisper promises into the ears of lobbyists. Every smile was rehearsed, every laugh carefully calculated, and at the center of it all sat Richard Halloway. He didn't need to announce himself. His presence spoke louder than any introduction. 6'3", silver hair combed back, eyes the sharp gray of a storm. A billionaire with the kind of arrogance that comes not just from money, but from the knowledge that nobody in this room could afford to challenge him. Wall Street worshipped him, Washington courted him, and tonight the city bowed at his feet. He was here to celebrate the expansion of Halloway Energy, an empire built on pipelines and oil rigs that stretched from Texas to West Africa. His company's profits had doubled in the last fiscal year, even as families across America struggled to pay heating bills. To him, that wasn't a contradiction, it was a triumph. Around his table sat the powerful Senator William Cartwright of New York, the governor of New Jersey, and the CEO of a media conglomerate that controlled half the evening news. And there, weaving between these giants with nothing but a tray in her hand, was Alicia Carter. The wolves were gathered, and she was moving through their den. Every time she approached their table, she felt the weight of their eyes. Not just Richard's, but his wife's, a woman draped in emerald silk, her diamonds flashing with every calculated gesture. Her gaze followed Alicia like a searchlight, dissecting her presence, her posture, her worth. To them, Alicia was not a person. She was a prop, a servant, a silhouette moving in and out of their expensive frame. But she wasn't just listening to their orders for more champagne. She was listening to their words, words spoken in whispers, half hidden behind laughter. Conversations about tax havens, mentions of accounts overseas, references to meetings in Montreal that were never meant for the public record. On the surface, the gala sparkled. But in the shadows of those conversations, Alicia began to sense something else, something dangerous, something the rest of the world would never hear unless someone like her was paying attention. She adjusted her tray, forcing her hands steady, even as her wrist throbbed from the earlier cut. And as Richard leaned back in his chair, raising his glass to toast a senator whose smile seemed too polished, Alicia realized something. This was more than a party. It was a gathering of power so vast that even one mistake, one overheard sentence, could shatter reputations. And she, bleeding, invisible, underestimated, was standing close enough to hear it all. The evening dragged forward with the smoothness of a perfectly rehearsed symphony. Plates of roasted duck and seared salmon swept past Alicia's shoulders. Silver forks clinked in rhythm. Glass after glass of champagne sparkled under chandelier light, reflecting the golden glow of wealth that few people in America would ever touch. To the guests, this was luxury. To Alicia, this was survival. Another night trading her dignity for dollars. She glided between tables with practiced grace, pressing the cloth napkin tighter against her wrist whenever the sting of the earlier glass threatened to buckle her hand. No one had asked if she was okay. Not a single person had noticed the blood that spotted her cuff. They were too busy congratulating each other for donations, business deals, and promises they'd never keep. She passed by Richard Holloway's table again. His wife caught her eye, lips curling into something cruel, as if Alicia's presence alone disrupted the symmetry of the room. Richard leaned closer to his circle. His voice was smooth, laced with arrogance, his French flowing as easily as the wine in his glass. "Regardez-la," he said with a smirk, tilting his head toward Alicia. "Look at her." A chuckle rolled through the men around him. Alicia paused for half a heartbeat, her tray hovering above the table beside theirs, but she kept moving. "Elle croit qu'elle est invisible," he continued. "She thinks she is invisible." Another burst of quiet laughter, muffled behind jeweled hands and expensive suits. Alicia's jaw tightened. Her breath grew shallow, but still she didn't react. She moved to the next table, lowering her tray, smiling that same tired smile she had mastered years ago. Richard wasn't finished. He leaned back, louder this time, his words aimed not just for his companions, but for the air itself. "Une servante stupide, rien de plus." A stupid servant, nothing more. The words landed like a slap. Several guests turned to glance at Alicia, some smirking, some pretending they hadn't heard at all. The orchestra continued, violins cutting through the silence that hung over her like smoke. Alicia froze. For a brief second, the tray in her hand felt impossibly heavy. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to leave the room, to escape, to protect herself. But another voice, deeper, sharper, older, rose inside her. The voice of every insult she had ever swallowed, the voice of every door that had been slammed, every professor who doubted her, every customer who spoke down to her. The voice of survival demanding, "How much longer?" But she said nothing. Not yet. She steadied her tray and walked on, eyes down, heart pounding so loudly she could feel it in her fingertips. The laughter followed her like a shadow. And still, beneath the humiliation, another truth grew stronger. He believed she didn't understand him. He believed French was his weapon, a private code of power and superiority. But Alicia knew better. Every word was sharp, clear, and unforgettable. And though she swallowed her response tonight, something inside her had already shifted. A storm was forming, quiet and dangerous, waiting for its moment to strike. Alicia's steps carried her toward the back of the ballroom, away from Richard's table, away from the cruel laughter that still rang in her ears. She needed air, even if the only air available was thick with cigar smoke and perfume worth more than her rent. She stopped briefly near the bar to set down her tray, steadying her shaking hand. She could still hear Richard's voice echoing in her head. "Une servante stupide." Nothing more. For years she had worked these rooms without incident. She had served cocktails to governors, cleared plates from film stars, refilled glasses for athletes whose jerseys she once cheered on television. None of it had ever cut her the way this did. Tonight wasn't just about being overlooked. It was about being deliberately diminished, her humanity reduced to a punchline in a language she wasn't supposed to understand. "Rough crowd tonight?" The voice startled her. She turned and found a man leaning casually against the end of the bar. Mid-30s, brown hair slightly unkempt, dark eyes that didn't flicker with mockery or arrogance, but with something else, curiosity. He wasn't dressed like the others. His suit was plain, worn at the edges, tie slightly loosened. A guest, yes, but not their kind of guest. Alicia hesitated, unsure whether to answer. Staff weren't supposed to talk to guests beyond "yes, sir," and "right away, ma'am." She forced a polite smile and turned back toward her tray. But he didn't look away. In fact, he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I heard what he said to you. I don't think anyone else here really understood it." Alicia froze, eyes narrowing. She hadn't expected that. "Excuse me?" she whispered, careful not to be overheard. The man gave a faint smile. "French. Not exactly the language you expect to hear in a room full of American oil and politics. Her pulse quickened. Few people ever noticed her enough to speak to her. Fewer still noticed what she understood. Before she could form a response, he reached into his pocket and slid a small card across the bar toward her. His tone was calm, almost matter-of-fact, but his eyes carried a weight that told her this wasn't a casual gesture. Daniel Reed, investigative journalist. If you ever want the world to hear the truth, call me. Alicia glanced down at the card. Simple, white, no company logo, no shiny branding, just his name, a number, and an email address. She looked up again, but he was already stepping back into the crowd, blending so easily she might have thought she imagined him. Her fingers trembled as she slipped the card into her apron pocket. She didn't know why she kept it, maybe because it was the first time all night someone had looked at her and seen more than a servant, maybe because the thought of truth being heard felt like the one weapon she had left. But truth was dangerous, especially in a room full of men who built empires on silence. As the orchestra swelled and another round of applause broke out near Richard's table, Alicia steadied herself once more, adjusting her tray, hiding the card as though it were contraband. For now, she said nothing. But for the first time tonight, she wasn't completely alone, and that changed everything. The night was wearing on, but the energy in the ballroom hadn't dulled. Deals were being whispered between handshakes, laughter rolled like thunder across the marble floors, and the orchestra played as though the music itself had been purchased to mask every secret. Alicia stayed in motion, table to table, smile after smile, always invisible, yet always watching. She thought she had escaped Richard's attention for the rest of the evening, until she rounded the corner of the service hallway. There he was, alone this time, phone pressed tightly to his ear, his voice low and sharp. She paused just out of sight, hidden by the curve of the wall. Oui, je les ai transférés, Richard said quickly, the French spilling from his mouth with urgency. Yes, I transferred them. Alicia's breath caught. She recognized the tone, not the insult, not the arrogance of before, but fear, a man protecting something. Non, pas ici, Montréal. No, not here. Montreal. His hand tightened around the phone, voice dropping further. Si quelqu'un découvre ça, nous sommes finis. If anyone discovers this, we are finished. The words sent a shiver through her. He wasn't talking about champagne, or hotels, or parties. This was something heavier, something meant to stay hidden. Alicia's mind raced. Montreal, transfers, finished. What was he moving? Money, documents, secrets that could ruin him if exposed. She shifted slightly, trying to hear more, but the tray in her hand clinked against the wall. A faint sound, barely noticeable, but enough. Richard froze. His head snapped up. For a split second, Alicia thought his gray eyes locked directly into hers. Then, slowly, he turned his back, lowering his voice again. Moments later, the call ended. He straightened his suit, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked back into the ballroom as though nothing had happened. Alicia pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The cut on her wrist burned again, but this time the sting wasn't from the glass. It was from the knowledge that she had stumbled onto something far bigger than she could possibly understand. She knew French had always been her strength, her passion, her escape. But tonight, it became something else, a weapon. And now she had a choice. Pretend she hadn't heard. Carry on like every other night, like every other waitress before her. Or hold on to those words. Montreal, transfers, finished, and risk everything. One path promised safety, the other promised danger. But for the first time, Alicia wondered if her silence had already cost her too much. The gala was at its loudest, glasses clinking, laughter spilling over like spilled wine. The orchestra reached a soaring crescendo, as though the entire city of New York was holding its breath under one roof. Alicia moved silently among the tables, her wrist aching, her apron hiding the small white card still tucked inside. Daniel Reed's words echoed faintly in her mind. "If you ever want the world to hear the truth, call me." But her focus wasn't on the journalist. It was on Richard Halloway. He had returned to his seat after that hurried phone call, his composure polished again, his arrogance restored. Around him, his circle leaned close, their conversation flowing as freely as the champagne Alicia poured into their crystal flutes. She lowered her tray carefully onto their table, her hands steady, her face blank. And just as she turned to leave, Richard's voice cut through the air once more, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Regardez-la, toujours là, comme une ombre." Look at her, always there, like a shadow. Soft chuckles rippled around the table. He wasn't finished. His eyes swept over her, dismissive, almost daring her to acknowledge him. "Une servante stupide," he repeated, smirking. "A stupid servant." The laughter grew bolder this time. One of the men at his table leaned back, grinning as though cruelty were entertainment. Even his wife joined in, a delicate laugh muffled behind jeweled fingers. Alicia froze. She could feel every eye nearby shift toward her, waiting, watching, expecting her to walk away like she always did, like she always had to. The weight of years pressed against her chest, years of swallowing every insult, every slight, every indignity. The sting of the glass cut on her wrist pulsed like a reminder of silence's cost. And then she exhaled, slowly, steadily. Her voice broke through the air, smooth, sharp, and unmistakably fluent. "Peut-être que vous devriez être plus prudent avec vos mots, monsieur." "Perhaps you should be more careful with your words, sir." The room froze. Forks stopped mid-air. Glasses hovered just short of lips. The orchestra played on, but nobody heard it anymore. All ears, all eyes were locked on her. Richard's smirk faltered. His wife's hand dropped from her mouth. The laughter that had filled the air moments before evaporated into silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. Alicia stood there, not smiling, not apologizing, not backing down. Her voice hadn't wavered, her accent was flawless, her French clear, her defiance undeniable. For the first time all night, she was no longer invisible. A murmur spread through the nearby tables. Some guests looked at each other in shock. Others whispered quietly, their curiosity lit like sparks in dry grass. Richard leaned forward, his storm-gray eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. The man who believed himself untouchable had been exposed, not by another billionaire, not by a senator, but by a waitress with a bandaged wrist and a voice strong enough to pierce through his fortress of arrogance. Alicia didn't wait for his reply. She lifted her tray, turned, and walked away, her heart pounding, her steps steady. Behind her the silence stretched. Then came the whispers. Then came the eyes that followed her every move. For the first time tonight, Richard Halloway was not in control, and he knew it. The applause that had filled the ballroom minutes earlier was gone. In its place lingered a heavy, restless silence. Alicia carried her tray back toward the service hallway, each step echoing like a drumbeat in her ears. She had spoken. She had finally answered back. But what now? She ducked into the corridor, where the glow of chandeliers gave way to the dim light of bare bulbs. The noise of the gala softened, replaced by the low hum of the kitchen. She pressed her back against the wall for a moment, steadying her breath. And then, footsteps, sharp, deliberate, coming closer. Alicia straightened just as Richard Halloway stepped into the hallway. He was alone, no wife, no entourage, no laughter now. His presence filled the narrow space, his tailored suit brushing against the walls as though the very corridor bent to make room for him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. His eyes locked on hers, cold, calculating. Then he leaned forward, his voice a low hiss. "You think you're clever?" Alicia said nothing. Her silence wasn't weakness now, it was defiance. Richard's lips curled, but his eyes stayed hard. "You embarrassed me, in front of senators, in front of governors. Do you understand what that means?" She gripped her tray tighter, forcing her hands not to tremble. "I only answered your words." His jaw tightened. "No, you made yourself a problem, and people like you don't get to be problems." He stepped closer, so close she could smell the expensive whiskey on his breath. "Listen carefully. If you ever repeat anything you hear tonight, anything, you won't just lose your job, you'll lose more than you can imagine." Her heart hammered, but she didn't back away. She met his gaze, steady, unflinching. He smirked faintly, as if amused by her defiance. "Montreal," he said suddenly, almost spitting the word, testing her reaction. Alicia's breath caught before she could stop it. His smirk widened. "Yes, I saw the way you froze earlier. You understand more than I thought, which makes you dangerous." The silence stretched. The kitchen clatter in the distance seemed far away, muffled, as though the world itself had shrunk to this single corridor. Richard leaned closer still, his whisper sharp as glass. "One word about Montreal, and you'll regret it." Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he stepped back, straightened his jacket, and walked away, disappearing into the ballroom as if nothing had happened. Alicia stood frozen, the tray trembling now in her hands. He knew she had heard. And now silence wasn't just about humiliation, it was about survival. She pressed her back against the wall, her breath shallow, her mind racing. For years her invisibility had been her shield. Tonight her voice had made her visible, and visibility was dangerous. But even as fear coiled in her chest, one truth remained. She couldn't unhear what he said. She couldn't unknow what she now carried. And the question clawed at her. What was worth more, her safety or the truth? Alicia forced herself back into the ballroom, her steps lighter than she felt. The air pressed down on her chest like a weight. Every sound, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the orchestra's sweeping melody, seemed distant, unreal. Her wrist throbbed under the bandage, but the sharper pain now came from Richard's threat. "One word about Montreal, and you'll regret it." She moved quietly, weaving between tables, collecting plates, refilling glasses, her mind replaying his voice again and again. And then, as she bent to clear an abandoned chair near Richard's table, her eyes caught something half-hidden beneath a folded napkin, a slip of paper. She hesitated, glancing around. The men at Richard's table were distracted, locked in a heated conversation with the senator. Alicia reached down quickly, sliding the paper beneath her tray before anyone could notice. In the corridor, away from the chandelier's glow, she unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a plane ticket, first class, one way, Montreal. Her pulse quickened, but it wasn't just the destination that froze her. It was the signature. At the bottom of the itinerary, in sharp, unmistakable ink, William Cartwright, the senator. Her breath caught. The senator who had been laughing at Richard's table minutes ago. The senator who shook hands like his smile was carved from marble. His name, his hand, tied directly to Richard's whispered call. Alicia folded the ticket quickly, tucking it into her apron. Her chest tightened. She hadn't meant to find this. She hadn't wanted to. But now, the weight of what she carried was undeniable. This wasn't just about being insulted in French. This wasn't about humiliation or arrogance anymore. This was about corruption, money moving across borders. A senator's name tied to secrets meant to stay buried, and she, an invisible waitress, was now holding proof. Every instinct screamed at her to throw it away, to pretend she hadn't seen it. But she couldn't. Not after the way Richard looked at her, not after the way his words dripped with certainty that she wouldn't dare fight back. Her hands shook as she slid the ticket deeper into her apron pocket. The orchestra swelled again, filling the air with a triumphant march. But Alicia knew better. For her, the music no longer signaled triumph. It was the sound of a fuse burning, and she was holding the spark that could set everything ablaze. Alicia slipped back into the ballroom, her apron pocket suddenly heavier than the tray she carried. The ticket burned against her side, its signature etched into her mind. Senator William Cartwright. She forced her face into neutrality, the mask of every service worker, smile, bow, retreat. But inside, her heart raced. Her steps were too quick, her breathing shallow, and that's when she felt it. A hand, soft, manicured, lightly brushing her arm. Alicia turned, startled. It was Evelyn Halloway, Richard's wife. Draped in emerald silk, diamonds glittering at her throat, Evelyn smiled with a softness that could have fooled anyone else in the room. Her voice, smooth and honeyed, carried just enough warmth to disarm. But Alicia caught the steel beneath it. "My dear," Evelyn purred, tilting her head, "you handled yourself so gracefully just now." Alicia froze, unsure whether to bow her head or walk away. Her instincts screamed danger, but Evelyn's grip on her arm was deceptively gentle, impossible to pull from without drawing attention. "You must understand," Evelyn continued, lowering her voice, "my husband, well, he has a way of speaking without thinking. He doesn't mean harm." Alicia stayed silent. Evelyn leaned closer, her perfume thick and suffocating. "But words, you see, can wound reputations, sometimes more than they wound people. You wouldn't want anyone to misunderstand tonight, would you?" It was phrased as a question. It was not a question. Alicia's heart hammered. She could feel the ticket pressing into her apron like a secret Evelyn somehow already knew. Evelyn's eyes glittered as she tightened her grip ever so slightly. "You seem intelligent. A girl like you could go far, if she learns when to hold her tongue." The sweetness in her voice never cracked. Her smile never faltered. To any onlooker, it looked like a wealthy woman complimenting a waitress, but Alicia knew better. Every word was a blade, wrapped in silk. And then, just as quickly, Evelyn released her arm, smoothing the fabric of her gown. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, dear," she said with that same dazzling smile before gliding back toward Richard's table. Alicia stood frozen, tray in hand, her pulse roaring in her ears. She had been threatened once by Richard, and now again by Evelyn, two sides of the same empire. But beneath the fear, another thought sparked. If they were so desperate to silence her, it meant what she carried was even more dangerous than she realized. Ask yourself, if you were in her place, would anyone fight for you? Subscribe right now and tell us your country in the comments. Because if this ever happened to you, someone here should have your back. And if you won't subscribe, then confess why you'd rather stay silent while others stand for dignity. The gala raged on. Toasts rang out, laughter bubbled like champagne, and the orchestra played louder, as if determined to smother every secret whispered in that room. But Alicia heard nothing, not the music, not the laughter, not the clinking glasses. All she could hear was her own pulse hammering in her ears, pounding against the folded ticket burning in her apron. Richard had threatened her. Evelyn had disguised her warning as kindness, and still she carried proof. She moved toward the far edge of the ballroom, where shadows lingered near the bar. Her steps slowed when she noticed him, Daniel Reed. The journalist stood there, blending into the crowd as though he belonged, yet never quite belonging. His loosened tie, his worn suit, everything about him clashed with the polished wolves who prowled the center tables. And still, his eyes never wavered. They found her instantly, as if he had been waiting. He lifted his glass slightly, subtle, a signal. Alicia hesitated. Every instinct told her to avoid him, to keep her head down, to finish her shift, to walk away alive. But something stronger tugged at her, the same fire that had made her answer Richard back in French, the same quiet voice inside that whispered enough. She approached cautiously, keeping her tray between them like a shield. "You found something," Daniel said quietly, without preamble. His tone wasn't questioning, It was certain. Alicia stiffened. You don't know what you're talking about. His lips curved faintly, but his eyes stayed serious. I know that look. I've seen it before. Someone holding something they shouldn't. Something powerful. And I know you're scared. Her hands tightened around the tray. You don't understand what these people can do. Daniel leaned closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. I understand perfectly. I've been chasing Richard Holloway for 2 years. Corruption, offshore accounts, bribes tied to politicians, always rumors, never proof, until tonight. Alicia's breath caught. He didn't know about the ticket, he couldn't, but his certainty rattled her. I can protect you, Daniel pressed, his voice urgent now. You don't have to fight this alone. Whatever you found, whatever you heard, it matters, and people need to know. Her chest tightened. His words lit the fire inside her, the one she had been trying to smother with silence. But another part of her screamed louder. Danger, survival, her brother's tuition, her mother's fragile health. One step toward Daniel was a step away from safety. But one step away from him was a step back into chains. She swallowed hard, her voice low. If I speak, they'll destroy me. Daniel's eyes held hers, unwavering. If you don't, they'll destroy countless others. You already know that. The weight of his words sank deep. Alicia said nothing, but her silence wasn't dismissal. It was the silence of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, toes over the ledge, wind howling, knowing the next move could change everything. For the first time, she wasn't sure whether she was more afraid of falling or of staying where she was. The ballroom glittered on, but for Alicia, time felt fractured, broken into jagged pieces of fear, fury, and the fragile hope Daniel had offered. His words still burned in her chest. If you don't speak, they'll destroy countless others. She gripped her tray, retreating into the corridor to steady herself. But as she turned the corner, 2 men in black suits stepped into her path. Security. Miss, one said flatly, his face unreadable, you're needed in the back office. Her pulse spiked. Her mouth went dry. She followed, her steps slow, the walls of the service hallway closing in around her. The men flanked her on either side, silent, their pace steady. They stopped at a door Alicia had never seen open before. One guard rapped twice, then pushed it wide. Inside sat Richard Holloway, and beside him, Evelyn. The glow of the gala chandeliers was gone here. The office was dim, the only light spilling from a desk lamp that cast long shadows across polished mahogany. On the desk lay a folder, thick with papers. Evelyn smiled, that same dazzling, suffocating smile. Alicia, she said sweetly, please come in. Alicia froze in the doorway, her throat tight. Richard's eyes were colder than ever. Do you know what happens, he said slowly, when an employee violates trust? Her voice caught. He cut her off, slamming a hand on the desk. They're fired, blacklisted, ruined. Evelyn leaned forward, her tone silk over steel. But sometimes, firing isn't enough. Sometimes people need to learn the cost of disobedience. Richard gestured, and one of the guards stepped forward, dropping a folder onto the desk in front of Alicia. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were photographs, her, carrying trays, talking to Daniel at the bar, standing in the corridor outside his phone call, each one time-stamped, each one proof that she had been watching, listening, gathering. Her stomach dropped. They hadn't just noticed her, they had been watching her, too. Evelyn's smile widened. You see, dear, in a room like this, invisibility is an illusion. We see everything, and we control what happens to those who forget their place. Richard leaned forward, his whisper sharp and venomous. You think you have something on me? On us? No, we have something on you. Pictures, lies, whatever story we want. And when we're done, Nobody will believe you were ever more than what I said you were." He paused, savoring her silence. "Un servante stupide." The words landed heavier this time, not just an insult, a verdict. Alicia's chest tightened, her breath shallow. The ticket in her pocket felt suddenly like both a weapon and a curse. She had proof, but they had power. And for the first time tonight, she realized the terrifying truth. Speaking might not just ruin her, it might bury her forever. The silence in the office was suffocating. The photographs lay spread across the desk like evidence at a trial, each one painting Alicia as an intruder, a spy, a problem to be erased. Richard leaned back in his chair, confident again, his smirk returning. "You see, Ms. Owens," he said softly, "we write the story here. Not you, not your little journalist friend. Us." Evelyn tilted her head, smiling sweetly. "And the story we tell will make you disappear." The words dug into Alicia's chest like claws. For a moment she felt her knees weaken. The images, the threats, the weight of the ticket in her apron, it was too much. They had cornered her completely. But then, something shifted. Her eyes drifted over the photographs again. The timestamp in the corner glowed faintly under the lamp's light, a detail most people wouldn't notice. But Alicia did, because she knew what time Richard had been on that phone call, and she knew the photographs didn't match. Her pulse quickened, not with fear this time, but with clarity. She lifted one photo, holding it steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This picture," she said quietly, "says I was in the hallway at 9:12. Richard smirked. "And?" Alicia met his gaze, her voice steady now. "And at 9:12 I was on the floor serving your table, with 3 senators watching." The smirk faded. Evelyn's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Alicia pressed on, her voice growing firmer. "These photos, they're lies, fabricated. Maybe they can scare me, maybe they can bury me, but if I call them out, if I show the truth, you'll have more than a waitress to worry about. You'll have the entire room questioning what else you've lied about." The office was still. Richard's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Evelyn's eyes flickered with something Alicia had never seen before, hesitation. Alicia's heart raced, but her voice didn't waver. "You said I was invisible, but tonight every person out there saw me answer you back. They noticed me, they heard me, and now they'll remember me." The silence stretched like a wire pulled tight. Then Evelyn's smile returned, sharper this time, but thinner. "You're clever," she whispered. "Clever enough to survive tonight, but cleverness can only carry you so far." Richard slammed the folder shut, the sound sharp as thunder. "This isn't over." No, it wasn't. Alicia knew that. But for the first time since stepping into this gilded cage, she had cracked their control. And deep inside, beneath the fear, a seed of defiance had taken root. When Alicia stepped out of the back office, the ballroom felt different. The chandeliers still glittered, the orchestra still played, and laughter still floated through the air. But beneath it all, something subtle had shifted. Heads turned as she passed. Whispers trailed her like shadows. She wasn't invisible anymore. A senator's wife leaned close to her companion, murmuring. A young aide at the bar glanced between Alicia and Richard's table, brows furrowed. Even the servers, who normally kept their heads down, exchanged fleeting glances as though they had witnessed something they couldn't quite name, and Richard noticed. From across the room, his storm-gray eyes followed Alicia, cold and sharp. He had tried to humiliate her. He had tried to silence her. He had even tried to bury her with fabricated proof. Yet somehow, she was still standing, and worse, people were beginning to see her. At his side, Evelyn whispered into his ear, her smile flawless, but her hand gripping his arm just a little too tightly. Alicia felt it with every step. The balance wasn't fully tipped yet, but the ground beneath Richard was shifting. His power, built on arrogance and silence, was cracking. She set down her tray at the bar, her hands trembling only slightly now. She could still feel the folded ticket in her apron pocket, its weight reminding her of the choice she hadn't yet made. Daniel appeared again, almost as if summoned by her thoughts. His voice was low, urgent. "They're nervous. You rattled them." Alicia shook her head. "They cornered me. They have pictures. Lies." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then expose them. Lies only work if you're too scared to speak. People saw what happened tonight. They'll remember it. That's your shield." She looked around. The stares, the whispers, the way silence had followed her after her reply. It was true. Her voice had already echoed farther than she'd intended. But was it enough? The orchestra shifted to a softer piece, the music almost mournful now. Alicia's chest rose and fell as she steadied herself. She wasn't naive. Richard still had power. Evelyn still had reach. Their threats weren't empty. One wrong step could destroy her. But for the first time, the thought crossed her mind. Maybe she wasn't the one who should be afraid. If you believe one voice can spark change, hit subscribe right now and write your city in the comments. And if you don't, then explain why silence feels safer than truth. The music faded into the background, replaced by the sound of Alicia's heartbeat. She stood near the bar, her apron heavier with every second. Inside it, the ticket, Montreal, Cartwright's signature. The one thing Richard and Evelyn couldn't spin, couldn't twist, couldn't fabricate. It was her shield. It was her weapon. It was also a target painted on her back. Daniel's eyes flicked toward her pocket, then back to her face. He didn't say the words, but she understood them. "Give it to me." Her hand twitched against her apron. She wanted to. Every fiber of her wanted to unload the burden, to hand the proof to someone stronger, someone safer, someone who could make it matter. But her brother's face flashed in her mind. His scholarship, her mother's quiet voice, reminding her of bills, of medicine, the fragility of the life she had built, balanced on silence. If she gave Daniel the ticket, she wasn't just exposing Richard, she was exposing herself. Across the ballroom, Richard stood now, towering over his table. His laugh rang out louder than the music, forced, brittle. Evelyn's hand lingered on his arm, her smile glued in place, but her eyes never left Alicia. The room shifted. She could feel it, a current. Guests whispering, watching, waiting. One wrong step, and Richard would crush her. One right step, and Richard might fall. Her fingers brushed the folded paper. For a heartbeat, she thought of pulling it out, handing it over, letting Daniel take the burden. But her hand froze when she caught something. Evelyn whispering to a guard near the exit. The guard's eyes flicked toward her. The trap was tightening again. Alicia's chest constricted. She had to move, but which way? Toward Daniel, risking exposure, or toward the door, risking silence forever? The ticket weighed her down like an anchor. And then, faintly, almost lost in the music, she heard her own voice echo back in her memory. "Perhaps you should be more careful with your words, sir." The room was listening. Even if Richard pretended it wasn't, even if Evelyn tried to smother it, the echo hadn't died. For the first time, Alicia realized something terrifying and liberating. She wasn't invisible anymore, and invisibility had always been her only shield. Now what? The ballroom gleamed with wealth and power, but to Alicia, it felt like a prison. Every polished smile, every glittering diamond, every clink of glass was another bar closing around her. Her hand pressed against her apron pocket, the ticket burning against her skin. Proof, leverage, danger. She turned slightly, enough to see the guard Evelyn had whispered to moments earlier. He wasn't looking at her casually anymore. His posture was sharp, his gaze fixed, waiting for a signal. Evelyn sat gracefully at Richard's side, her emerald gown shimmering under the chandeliers. She looked serene, like the perfect hostess, but her eyes betrayed her. They followed Alicia's every movement, precise, calculating. Then, it happened. Evelyn lifted her hand, delicately adjusting the diamond necklace at her throat. A small, graceful gesture, harmless to anyone else. But the guard shifted instantly, moving toward Alicia with slow, deliberate steps. Her chest tightened. She glanced toward Daniel, who stood just a few feet away, his expression urgent, pleading. He shook his head slightly, warning her, "Don't run, not yet." The guard's path cut through the crowd, and the chatter in the room seemed to dim. A few nearby guests noticed, their eyes flicking between the guard and Alicia. Whispers spread, subtle but unmistakable. Richard leaned back in his chair, watching it unfold with the satisfaction of a man convinced the outcome was already written. Alicia's breath came shallow. She was trapped. Too far from the exit, too close to the evidence in her pocket. The guard was almost at her side. Her mind raced. If she handed Daniel the ticket now, the guard would see. If she kept it, they could search her. Either way, her secret would be exposed. But then, an idea struck her. She shifted her tray in her hands, just enough to hide the way her fingers slipped the folded ticket beneath a linen napkin on the bar. Smooth, subtle, invisible. The guard stepped up beside her. "Ma'am," he said firmly, his hand hovering near her elbow. "Mr. Halloway would like a word." The room went quieter, not silent, but quieter. Too many eyes on them now, too many people sensing the tension under the surface. Alicia swallowed hard, her face calm, her hands steady on the tray. "Of course," she said softly, her voice even, but inside her heart pounded, because the ticket, the proof, was no longer in her pocket. It was on the bar, inches from Daniel's hand. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flickering for the first time. Richard leaned forward, sensing movement in the current he couldn't quite see, and Alicia walked toward the lion's den, the guard at her side, leaving the proof behind. If you were Alicia, would you hand over the proof or risk walking into the trap with nothing but your wits? Subscribe right now and drop your answer in the comments. This choice could mean life or destruction. The guard led Alicia through the service corridor again, his hand brushing her elbow as though she were some unruly guest rather than a server. Her shoes clicked against the tile, each step carrying her closer to the office she had barely escaped earlier. She forced her breathing to steady, her face calm, her body obedient. But inside, her pulse raced like a drumline, because this time, she wasn't walking in with the ticket. The guard opened the door. Richard sat at the desk again, his storm-gray eyes fixed on her, unblinking. Evelyn lounged in the leather chair beside him, her emerald gown flowing like liquid, her smile polished, predatory. "Leave us," Richard ordered. The guard nodded once and closed the door. The silence that followed was heavy. Evelyn broke it first. "My dear," she said smoothly, her voice carrying both charm and venom, "you've been very brave tonight, but bravery is often confused with stupidity." Richard leaned forward, his knuckles pressing into the desk. "You embarrassed me. Twice. In front of people who matter. And you're still here, still standing, as if you think that makes you untouchable." Alicia swallowed, standing tall despite the weight pressing down on her. "I did my job." Richard's laugh was low, bitter. "No, you forgot your place. And people who forget their place," his gaze sharpened, "are reminded." Evelyn crossed her legs elegantly, her diamond bracelet catching the lamplight. "Tell me, Alicia," she said sweetly, "what do you think happens to a girl like you when stories start circulating? When whispers say you were caught stealing, or worse, when your name becomes synonymous with scandal?" Alicia's throat tightened, but her expression didn't falter. She thought of the ticket, of Daniel, of the small act of slipping proof out of her pocket and into safety. They didn't know. They thought she was cornered. They thought they still controlled the narrative. For the first time, Alicia felt a flicker of power return. She looked Richard dead in the eye. "You can tell whatever story you want about me, but I wonder, what story will people tell about you after tonight?" For a split second, silence, a fracture in their perfect facade. Evelyn's smile thinned, brittle at the edges. Richard's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming against the desk. They didn't know what she meant. They didn't know what she had passed off, but doubt, it had crept in, and doubt was poison in their world. Richard leaned back, forcing a smirk. "You're playing a dangerous game." Alicia steadied her breath, her voice low but unwavering. "So are you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Richard's eyes narrowed. Evelyn's smile vanished, and for the first time the balance felt uncertain, not just for Alicia, but for them. The question isn't whether Alicia will survive this night, it's whether Richard and Evelyn can survive the truth. Back in the ballroom the air was restless. Daniel Reed stood at the bar, the untouched glass of whiskey still in his hand. To anyone watching, he was just another tired guest, a man out of place but harmless. No one saw the folded ticket beneath the napkin he had slid into his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed against it now, feeling the crease of the paper, the faint imprint of Cartwright's signature. Proof. The kind of proof that could rip open the empire Richard Halloway had built brick by brick, lie by lie. But Daniel also knew what this meant. The second Richard realized it was gone, Alicia's life would be worth less than the napkin that had hidden it. He scanned the room. Evelyn's guard had led her away. The guests laughed, oblivious, but there was tension. He could feel it. The orchestra's notes rang too sharp, the chatter too quick. Whispers were moving through the crowd. Alicia had already changed the current without even knowing it. Daniel pulled his phone from his pocket, angling it low. He snapped a photo of the ticket, fingers fast, deliberate. Then another in case the first was blurred. Insurance. But it wasn't enough. A picture could be dismissed, doctored, spun. The original was the blade. The kind of blade that could cut deep into men like Richard Halloway. The problem? Holding a blade meant bleeding too. Daniel took a slow breath, slipping the phone back into his pocket. His eyes darted to the far side of the ballroom where a senator's aide lingered. Contacts, allies, risks. He couldn't make his move yet. Not here, not now, but soon. Then, he felt it. A shadow fell across his shoulder, one of Richard's guards. "Sir," the man said flatly, "Mr. Halloway would like a word." Daniel forced a casual smile, even as his stomach dropped. "Funny," he said lightly. "I didn't know Mr. Halloway was in the business of chatting with reporters." The guard's face didn't move. "Now." Daniel's hand brushed his jacket pocket, feeling the sharp edge of the ticket against his palm. He knew what this was. Richard didn't want a word. He wanted control. He wanted to corner him, just as he had cornered Alicia. But Daniel had something Richard didn't know yet. He had the proof. The guard's hand tightened on his arm. Guests nearby pretended not to notice, their eyes sliding away. Silence was always easier than involvement. Daniel's heart hammered. He had a choice. Go with the guard and risk losing everything, or make his move now in the open, where eyes would have to watch. Either way, the game had shifted. And for the first time, Richard Halloway wasn't the only man holding the blade. Daniel has the proof in his pocket, but if he's caught, it all vanishes. What would you do? Protect yourself, or risk it all to expose the truth? Subscribe and drop your answer in the comments. Let's see who's brave enough to choose. The ballroom was no longer humming, it was buzzing. At first it was subtle, a glance here, a murmur there, a too long pause between sips of champagne. But within minutes, it became something more. A current of unease rippled through the room, impossible to ignore. Guests leaned into one another, voices lowered but sharp with curiosity. Did you hear how she answered him back? And in French, no less. Did you see his face? She's still here. Why hasn't she been dismissed? The questions floated across the marble floor, building momentum like sparks searching for kindling. At Richard's table, the cracks were beginning to show. His laugh came too loud, his gestures too broad. The kind of performance meant to remind everyone that he was still in control, but the tighter he gripped, the more obvious it became. He was slipping. Evelyn leaned in close, her hand on his arm, whispering with urgency masked by a smile. To most, she looked poised. But Alicia, even from across the room, caught it, the faint tension in her jaw, the flicker of worry in her eyes. The orchestra's melody swelled, but no one was listening anymore. Attention was fractured, shifting, restless. Eyes lingered on Alicia as she crossed the room with a tray, the same eyes that once would have slid past her without a thought, and Daniel. Daniel was still standing near the bar, the guard's grip tight on his arm. Guests noticed. A few frowned, whispering. Why was security detaining a guest? Why was a reporter even here? For the first time that night, Richard's fortress of silence was cracking, not from a single blow, but from the collective weight of curiosity, the kind of curiosity that could turn into scrutiny, the kind of scrutiny men like him feared. Then came the moment. Senator Cartwright himself rose from his table. His voice boomed, jovial, cutting through the whispers. "Richard, my friend, tell us, what was that little exchange earlier? Quite the entertainment." The room went still. All eyes turned to Richard. His jaw clenched. He forced a smile, raising his glass. "Ah, just a misunderstanding. The help sometimes forgets themselves, you know how it is." But even as he spoke, the room didn't laugh with him. The chuckles were strained, hesitant. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others looked at Alicia again. And in that silence, short but heavy, Richard Halloway felt something he hadn't felt in years: control slipping. The room wasn't his anymore. One voice challenged a billionaire, and now whispers are shaking his empire. If you believe silence fuels oppression, subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. Show this community that one voice can spark 1,000.